Welcome to the Preservation Association Brown Bag Lecture Series. My name's Eileen Burkton. I'm the coordinator of these brown bags. The videotaping today is sponsored by the Historic Preservation Fund of the U.S. Department of the Interior through the Nebraska State Historical Society and the City of Lincoln, a certified local government. Our speaker today is Ed Zimmer. Ed was a historic preservation planner in in Lincoln City and County government from 1985 to 2020. Since retiring, Ed remains an active community historian and volunteer. He recently has finished 2 books, the 3rd and final volume of the Near South Walking Tour book, and a book on Lincoln postcards with Jim McKee. Ed is native to Omaha, Nebraska, and has an undergraduate degree from Lindenwood College and a PhD from Boston University. Today we are continuing the celebration of the 30th anniversary of PAL. Ed is going to speak on this today, and we are going to have cake at the end of the program to honor the 30th anniversary. The title of Ed's talk today is PAL's 3 Decades in 60 Minutes. Please join me in welcoming Ed.
Thank you for showing up. It's much more fun when there are people here. And one of the people who can't be here but is always at PAL events is Helen Busalis. As I was invited to give this 3-decade summary of PAL history, I kept going back to and always starting with Helen. When I came in 1985, she was just a couple years out of the mayor's office. She had served 4 terms on the city council, 2 terms as mayor, and I would guess in all that time, when she would call me up and tell me what to do, I knew she wasn't the mayor anymore, but maybe she didn't, or she was just being Helen. And she would often call and say, Lincoln needs a citizen preservation group. And I would say, I completely agree. It should be a citizens group, not one directly out of city government. And I am now in city government. Yes, I understand that, Ed. You need to get it started. And we had that talk several times. It had me thinking about preservation groups I had seen. I had been 11 years in Boston, which had a very contentious preservation scene. And one of the beauties of coming to Lincoln was a more congenial community. But some of the things I had seen in Boston was groups that had an ongoing program, seemed to be stronger than ones that arose around a specific issue. And I thought about the Maple Lodge issue, beautiful building on Euclid near 20th, that had been very threatened in the 1960s and still in the 70s. And citizens rallied around it and helped keep it standing, and eventually in 79 Bob Allington bought it, and the folks that organized to help keep it standing, the purpose had been served and were no longer active in 85. There was a beginning and sort of a disappearing of a Lincoln Lancaster Historical Society, but it wasn't principally a preservation group. But I was thinking some kind of continuity, some kind of fun, maybe some education. I'd been involved in walking tours and historic presentations in Boston. So those are the tools I could think of. This is a beautiful drawing of Maple Lodge before it was. This is Ferdinand Fisk's original conception for Maple Lodge in 1909. So these are the kind of ideas I had in mind. And I was beginning to find out of my ongoing work, things like Haymarket seemed to be of interest to people. There are a lot of service groups in this town that had weekly meetings and wanted weekly programs, and I found they were a market. They may or may not have cared about preservation, but if you would come and speak to them, they would listen. So I was using Haymarket that way. We were doing tours. And the opportunity to get into special places that maybe you didn't feel welcome otherwise also seemed like a draw. And one of those special places in the late 80s, early 90s was the old Federal Building, U.S. Post Office and Courthouse. We would now call it Grand Manse. And the maybe most special room there was the old and then abandoned courtroom up on the third floor in the East Wing in the original 1904, 1905 part of the building. Beautiful paneled room, suffering by a dropped ceiling that was not original, and fluorescent egg crate lights, and the wall opposite the beautiful entrances was a nicely plastered wall that should have had 3 windows, but they had been plastered up by this time. But it was a neat room. And so as an idea of maybe satisfying my never but still present mayor, Helen, I went to my Rolodex and prepared some postcards and invited people I just thought might be interested to this room and a little talk. I don't remember what the talk was about, but there was some slide presentation. And at the end I asked people, would you like to do that again? Was that fun? And they agreed that being invited to a talk was fun. And I said, well, we could get this room. Nobody else uses it. I could send you postcards when we get a topic and get it scheduled. This isn't really part of the city that I'm talking about here. And so if anybody wanted to give me some postcard stamps or something, that'd be nice. I'm not going to put this on the city's account. Just a couple of years ago at a wedding reception in Donovan, Nebraska, this cheerful lady in the buffet line comes up behind me and says, would you be Ed Zimmer? And well, that's kind of a strange question. I think as far as I know, I always have been Ed Zimmer, but I guess I said, yes, I am Ed Zimmer, and you are? And she said, I'm Marion Offenbergy's mother. I've had maybe 6 dozen, maybe 80, 90 student interns in my years up in the planning department. But the name Marion Offenbergy, which is kind of musical in a way, and the bright young woman that lady was, I could say, yes, I do remember Marion. She was the student undergraduate intern who gave me the first sheet of postcard stamps to invite people to come to talks, out of which PAL grew. If we had a Volunteer of the Year award, we could call it the Marion Offenbergy Award. She's still a cheerful lady. She's not an undergraduate anymore, but like her mother, I'm sure a lovely lady. And I haven't seen her in 35 years probably. But Marion came across right away with a sheet of postcard stamps. And I invited people another month, and I think it was in the 2nd or 3rd month I said, if you like this, I think maybe you could have a group that did this, and I would participate with you, but it really needs to be external to me. It should be, sometimes you want to tell the city what to do, where I work. You should be separate and independent. Until retirement, I was never a board member. I think I had pretty good attendance at board meetings, but I never was a board member. I was a community advisor. Tam Allen was the first president of the new group. Here's the Articles of Incorporation as a nonprofit corporation in January 1993. So this is the 30th year. PAL had been active at least in 92 before that, before the formal organization. But this is as good a year, and the last couple of years we could hardly get together anyway. So this must be the right year to celebrate and have cake. Well, the activity and that ongoing activity, and I'll talk a lot about the brown bags because I think that has been an amazing strength of PAL all the way through. But those other purposes, the advocacy purposes of PAL, do arise. You can't predict when they'll come up necessarily, but the one that was active in the early 90s and around which much of the advocacy activity occurred was the old St. Elizabeth's Hospital on South Street. And this was that amazingly long building along the South Street frontage dating back to the founding of St. Elizabeth Hospital in a private home on this site in the 1880s, and then beginning to build at the west end and building down along the street in multiple building campaigns through the first half of the 20th century. When the new St. Elizabeth was built out on 70th Street, and the institution moved there, and I think it was 69. The county soon bought the old hospital and operated a nursing home there called Lancaster Manor, and then built a new one in the early 80s on the west end of the property, right about 11th Street, and the building stood vacant for several years. Maybe it was early 90s the Lancaster Manor was built, but late 80s, early 90s. The hospital stood empty. The county was looking at plans for demolition. Their property manager had this great big building that people were breaking into with asbestos and all kinds of challenges. And here this new group arises that says, are you sure that's what you want to do? Could this building be used in some other way? Could it perhaps be used to meet the affordable housing need that the community still has? And persuaded, and there was also down, and it's invisible in that early view, and it's invisible pretty much when the building was standing, there was also this magnificent chapel attached as a south wing way down at the east end, but it stood invisible from South Street, and it was simply the chapel wing of the hospital, built in 1921. Jacob Nottigal of Omaha was the architect who did a lot of Catholic church architecture. And it was a remarkable interior in that its transition from the Catholic hospital to the county nursing home meant that it came out of Catholic ownership and use about the time most of the Catholic interiors were being remodeled in the liturgical reforms of the 60s and 70s. And this was still an early 20th century Catholic interior, richly decorated, beautiful stained glass windows, lots of statuary, Stations of the Cross, and all of those things that the active Catholic churches typically were simplifying at that time. Powell got a stay of demolition as early as October of '92. This is before the incorporation, and then got a several-month stay where the county board agreed they would have their architecture firm that was working on their planning activities, and that was Sinclair Hilly, look at, could this be converted to housing? What might it cost? What are some of the programs available? City Urban Development stepped forward and participated in that study with some of the grant programs they had. Historic tax credits were a possibility. They pulled all those pieces together, and they said, we could get together, it was something like $4 or $5 million to carry out a project here. But it would take $6 or $7 million. And there was a significant gap that no one saw where that could be closed. PAL had accomplished its initial purpose. It got a good, thorough look at, can this be used in a better way? And the answer ended up being plausibly no. But even by the time the county announced it would proceed with demolition, the chapel had come off the chopping block. There was enough energy around it between PAL and others interested in the chapel that by the time demolition was announced, and it was going to occur in '94, it was no longer a consideration that the chapel would be torn down. And in fact, the county committed this building that had never been a freestanding independent building, so it had no front door, it had no stairs. The county would put it back, they would demolish around it and put it back into usable condition as a initially non-denominational chapel, and still stands today as the Church of St. Francis of Assisi. Has magnificent stained glass windows. That is St. Elizabeth window on the left for the name of the hospital, and the St. Francis window on the right. And there's just an immense number of windows on this little building, now very well protected. It is back in church use. A Catholic order of priests who are sanctioned to present the Latin Mass, the traditional Mass, in this very traditional interior. And the landmark designation that the city put on the building said, we never had seen it as an exterior. It was always just an interior when people experienced it. And so it is the interior that we are most interested in this building. And in fact, came up with language that the Preservation Commission would review remodels on the interior. It actually has been enhanced since its original interior, because the order of priests now operating in the building wanted it even a more traditional Catholic interior. And they've done some additional work on the stenciling and some of the embellishment, but they've also done a great job protecting the windows and keeping them in good condition, and it still remains that community asset. And the first big preservation project that PAL had been actively involved in. At the annual meeting this year, longtime PAL treasurer Gordon Scholes could identify funds that when the non-denominational group that was supporting the chapel went out of business and the county transitioned it over back to a church and Catholic use, there were some funds left over from that foundation who put them into PAL coffers for educational purposes. There's still a St. Francis Chapel Foundation element in PAL's ongoing budget reports, because there's that relationship all the way back to the beginning and almost the proto-PAL of 1992. Back to that courtroom, looking back 30 years, many of the threads weave through PAL's history, which is appropriate if you're a preservation group. If things stay around, you keep visiting them and using them and seeing them hopefully both preserved and enhanced. And that courtroom, which looked kind of grim, it was an interesting place, but rather grim, was renovated in the private renovation of what is today known as Grand Manse, the old U.S. Post Office courthouse. This was the first redo that made the woodwork jump out again. The ceiling was revealed, and it was in wonderful condition. And the light coming in to this view, both illuminating that ceiling, is the reopening of the 3 huge windows on the east side. I imagine in an early day without air conditioning, morning sessions in this courtroom were probably miserable with these great big windows, and somewhere along, some judge or whatever the predecessor to GSA was said, let's just plaster those in. And there was nice plaster work over those windows, but the windows had always been there. Now they are there again, and it's just a spectacular room. And it even has come along one other step. Now with the second private owners of the building, they did some further coloring of the ceiling and some murals in the room, and this room really gleams, maybe like the chapel, a step beyond what it ever had been, but certainly a delightful space. And PAL had the opportunity to come back a few times over for annual meetings in that great room. So it has sort of a continuing presence in PAL history. Advocacy activities, annual meetings with the award program, and especially the monthly brown bag program, I think have been the mainstays that have kept PAL going into its 30th year and have kept PAL available when those unpredictable preservation events come up. It was in that room that the Funk House was honored with the Stewardship Award one year. This was, I think, about 2012, 2013. Beautiful Ferdinand Fisk House at 16th and A. Go in through that little kind of quiet entry, and the living room opens up in front of you. You're looking at the whole 2-story height and a staircase going up to the 2nd floor, which I will show you. I shouldn't just wave my arms, but we'll get to that. But in between, from that little quiet entrance and that big space that it rises to on the back, there had been a devastating fire on the interior. It is a little early. It must have been about 9 or 10 that we honored this one. But all kinds of charring on the interior, horrible soot damage all over the golden woodwork, and the owner and the insurance and Paul Davis Restoration got together. That is the before above and the after below, and they put it back in lovely condition. One of Ferdinand Fisk's, I think, most beautiful interiors and dramatic interiors with this beautiful oak woodwork. And it's back. And there's that staircase experience as you step in through this little kind of, and it's one of those, we'll take you through a tiny vestibule so we can really explode the space in front of you with this beautiful staircase in front of. And this was Susan Marks and her, the leaders of her crew with Paul Davis, who put it together in the courtroom on that annual meeting event. Powell often visited places that either had been recently restored or before their renovations, or ideally both. And Whittier was one that was both. Not quite abandoned, but it was underutilized for many, many years. And then, and Powell got an opportunity to have an annual meeting there in the underutilized years of the building, and then again when the university found its use and purpose and put it back into active daily use. Trinity Methodist down at 16th and A was another church that was in the moment of deciding, would they stay in the old building, would they move to the edge of town, and they moved southeast. And Powell had the opportunity to have a meeting there, I think both before and then has visited it since, and now it is in the active use of a new church congregation. That this kind of attention to it over the years, I think, helped keep it available and in play until a new, younger congregation could come along and find its home there. Had an annual meeting in caves, in a cave, or a brewery basement and a cave. Blue Bud Brewery was using Robbers Cave at that time, and Powell had an annual meeting there in 2017. I think this was our first underground meeting. Some of the annual meeting locations were not frivolous, but at least lighthearted. We had an annual meeting at Lee's Restaurant when some activity was going on at Pioneers Park that was being celebrated. And I think we were also celebrating the return of the rooster to his post out in the parking lot, because he had been stolen and then returned. And many of us had dinner afterwards at Lee's. We had a meeting at the original Valentino's location on Holdridge under its original Lincoln pizza sign. And Tony Massinio was part of that meeting. My favorite piece of that meeting was him talking about Saturday nights. We used to have a lot of students come in just before we'd close at 10 o'clock, and they'd buy the pizzas for like a dime on a dollar, or just a really reduced price, that had been ordered during the day but hadn't been picked up. And then they finally kind of cottoned on to some of the students maybe were ordering those pizzas and not picking them up until 5 minutes to 10, when somebody came in and said, "Can I have the Smith pizza, pepperoni and mushroom, please?" In the crowd, Tony tells this story, and in the crowd, a middle-aged guy says, "That was me." He was a neighbor. He had gone to the university and then settled in the East Campus neighborhood, and he was there at the last day event to fess up that he'd been calling in specific custom pizzas that he wanted to be able to come back and get for $1. I don't think Tony didn't charge him the full price at that event. But I also like that sign had stood out in the right-of-way all of its time, where you can't put a pole sign. When the building came down, but Val's was going to stay just across the street in the location, I really didn't want to see that sign go away. And there's not a way to exactly get a sign permit for a pole sign on a public right-of-way unless you're doing a redevelopment agreement and you write it into the streetscape. So we wrote the pole sign into the streetscape that they had to do it. They wanted to do it. We had to deal somehow that our sign regulators could say, well, I guess we got to let you do it. It says there in the redevelopment agreement. City Council approved it. It's there on paper. There's a purpose, too, in having the same guy in the office upstairs, if you can, for 35 years, because you get some relationships developed. And, I also like looking back at these annual meetings and the award programs, that sometimes we were back at the same place time and again, but for a very good purpose. The FM Hall House, or Anna and FM Hall House at 11th and D, got a stewardship award, very rightly, in 2007, when Ed and Yana Baranek were there. Ed's predecessors, through about the 1930s, had owned the property and converted it into a multi-unit apartment building for many, many years. And Ed and Yana were deconverting it back to a residence, I think with some B&B options as well. But this lovely Victorian on the northwest corner of 11th and D, the Outcalled House, they were keeping in lovely condition. They'd given it a new paint job. They had beautiful interior features and stained glass windows, wonderful huge porch, and these were the kind of late Victorian porches that were really an outdoor summer living room. And you read in the newspaper about the card parties and the events. Those events would often have a list of the 100 people who participated in that party on the porch. This is that big, beautiful porch. And some of the stained glass, I think this is on the staircase in that building. Well, back 8 years later, we're returning to give the Residential Rehab Award to Paula and Greg Baker and their family in the same building, because they had taken it the next step. A beautiful paint job that brought up the features. If you looked at the older views in black and white, there were multiple colors. I don't know if they were these ones, but these look fine and make it much easier to see the beautiful detail of the house, and also the wonderful yard where Elizabeth Dolan had done a couple of en plein air paintings that she dates. She doesn't, in the title of these paintings, she says Hall House Yard, and on a time of day, the moment, the hour of these paintings. This was a view in the garden looking south towards the porch, and under the Baker's care, those features are preserved. And this is Dolan looking north towards the garden house, which is still there and cherished by the Bakers. So in our long history of this house in the community and with PAL, we've had the opportunity to see it being preserved and then getting even better. That's the terracotta fountain in the back alley wall of that carriage house, of that little garden house. And that brings to mind, as I look over the annual meeting records I have, already by 2007 we could be celebrating 15 years of brown bags. And I think at every one of those Eileen was introducing it, or after the first maybe two before PAL was organized. Eileen has coordinated these for 30 years. 30 times 12 would be 360 brown bags, roughly. We had a couple of years in the pandemic that we couldn't count those, but we're well over 300. And I think until the pandemic, there wasn't a month went by that there wasn't a brown bag presentation. Sometimes it was Jim McKee or Bob Ripley or me or Ripley, and then me and then Jim, and many other folks in the community as well. Topics including the Capitol restoration and whatever I had learned over time about yet another Lincoln architect I could talk about, or focusing on the annual awards every year. But I think this has been the most remarkable, and I think the real continuity of PAL is every month folks who wish can get together and hear something about their community's history. And it's always local, it's always something pertinent to Lincoln. And then, about 10 years ago or so, it must have been 15 or 20, we started going on the air. Let's say 15 years. When I first stood in front of the cameras at the Historical Society's little auditorium, I thought, don't be nervous. Nobody's going to watch this. It's just these people in the room. Who goes to, it was then Channel 5, I think, that was our public access. But as far as I know, nobody watches Channel 5, and they don't even know when they'll come on. You know, it'll happen. Somebody will see it. About the next month, I'm in the mayor's meeting room in the old county city building, and this gruff voice behind me says, "Driving down 27th Street with my family." And I said, "That's an Italianate." I turned around, and Tom Cassidy had been watching the PAL program on house styles in Lincoln and wanted to let me know. A little bit later, I'm at the library on a winter evening. It's dark out, and I'm standing at the light waiting for it to turn to green, and I'm aware I grew up in an urban environment, that big city, Omaha. And I was 11 years in Boston, and I'm aware of a man standing beside me, partly because I can catch an odor of a man standing beside me, and so I'm just being alert but calm. And he clears his throat, and I get less calm. And he says, "I like those shows you do on TV." I don't know where he was watching, but the viewership, I came to learn, was very broad. And it was local. People, even if they were just channel surfing, would come by Channel 5 and see a face they knew or a voice they'd heard or a scene that they recognized, and they would stop and stay. And I think that became a broad impact. And then as we got onto YouTube, and we have now, in the last decade, I think 144 PAL videos on YouTube. And these live on, or available to people. They ask a question, you say, well, look me up on YouTube. There's a show on it there. And Eileen keeps standing up and introducing those over the years. This was the hall talk at the old Historical Society History Nebraska's auditorium. Pandemic kind of broke the chain of attendance there. We started using spaces in the county city building, and now I think much more convenient for our friends at LNK-TV and for their costs in getting these on the air, so we can get more done together by being in their studio. That's where we now meet. But we also, as those were going on, we were able to participate in things like the Sheldon putting up an exhibit on FM Hall and Anna Hall and their contribution to the Sheldon, where something like a quarter of the objects at the Sheldon were either gifts from the hall or bought with hall bequests. And as that was going on at the Sheldon, we could be presenting the hall and the house part of the story. In fact, we did a bicycle ride from the hall house in that period as well. So the many ways we could coordinate with other cultural and historic activities in the community and stay relevant and in the public eye, so that when we needed, people had heard of PAL. The Speedway property support of Jim McKee's Complete History series. There was a number one. I did the research. It was 2013. I think Eileen stood up and said this was a new series, and we expected it would run maybe a couple years, and maybe there might be as many as 15 parts to it. Clay Smith, sponsor on behalf of Speedway Properties, helped introduce Jim at that first 2013 meeting. And just recently in this room, the LNK TV studio, Jim gave program 38, and I think he's now given 39. We're about to turn the corner to 40. That's Jim's correct and unique spelling of complete, and I think it means history's never over. Or as Jim will say, it's just one thing after another. So it goes on as it should. There's Jim presenting in this studio. Bob continues to speak and share the most important and precious monument in town, the Capitol, and the progress and changes there. And Eileen is the unchanged part of the program. And unlike the rest of us that lose our hair and it changes color, Eileen just always looks the same. So we don't know how that happens. In the attic, is there a portrait that ages and you don't? We don't want to go there. But here we are with Bob presenting that wonderful program. I really enjoy looking back and seeing the faces who show up still. Some of them are gone, but many continue. Keith awarded the Solace Award, the top award in 2007 at the annual meeting just last Friday. Frank Ordea, a present instructor at the university in historic preservation, received the awards. We get continuity all through. We don't have Joe Gutzel in the community anymore, but Joe was a big part of PAL's founding and was president and received the Busalis Award from Matt Hansen and Gary Martin, who are still very much present in PAL. So it's nice to have both the continuity and the change. Do you know this lady, Kay?
No.
Receiving the Great Commoner Award, the Education Award, for her beautiful website that I still turn to all the time on the architecture of both City and East Campus. Kay has since published a book as well through the Arcadia Press on the architecture and pictorial history of UNL. And there's great stuff behind this site. So we've gotten a little into the 20th century and the 21st with social media and web presence. Some of our awards have been just kind of unique, although I haven't seen one looking back that I thought was not well chosen. This was to Public Works for the rebuild of the Harris Overpass, the 50s overpass, which used to be a hotel for at least several hundred or maybe a few thousand pigeons, and you really didn't want to walk underneath it. And the new overpass on the same location, that the great virtue is it has a ceiling on it, and it's pretty clean and bright underneath. And the streets were reordered, and you can drive underneath and park to the sides, and the businesses and the buildings have redeveloped to both sides of it. And that subtle engineering change has really changed. Where is the south edge of Haymarket? Well, it's somewhere considerably south of where it used to be. Used to be, when you walked under that overpass, you knew you were about done. And now the buildings on the south side have been rehabbed, partly, I think, because of this well-designed, necessary infrastructure rebuild, but to put a lid on it was a good thing. And PAL's City Center Award is not for a preservation, individual building preservation, but for something that enhances the urban environment and makes it more pleasant and enjoyable for us to be together in the middle of our city. This is one of those things. And then in 12, I would present the awards each year, and I'd build a PowerPoint, and I get to the final award that was, I was told, put Peter in there, Peter Bleed, our wonderful archaeologist who was at the university and is now retired from our community, but very appropriate PAL award until the last minute. I think it was Gary Martin came up to me and said, we've got a switch on the Busalis Award, and gave me this PowerPoint. And I hadn't noticed that they had my 3 children in the back of the room. I don't know. When I'm presenting, I get kind of focused. But this was the year I got the Busalis Award on a total switch of the guy who had the PowerPoint and the clicker in his hand. And they pulled it off very nicely. This is also the basis of a little piece I put together, and I don't think PAL has it on the site anymore, but it was the Field Guide to Lincoln Historians, to how to distinguish Jim McKee from Ed Zimmer. And I said it was as a matter of hair color. He had more of it, but mine was darker. I had more lines on my face than he did, and I always had my glasses on, and his were usually on a little librarian's chain around his neck. And we went through those features so that people would be able to distinguish between the two of us, and it doesn't work. Even today, with facial hair, I'm still called Jim, and he's still called Ed, which I take as a great compliment. Other figures who've been with us a long time and contributed and continue to contribute: John Strope, Happy John, always Happy John, and I think did a lot of work also for Jim on the complete series, where he was helping transition Jim's slides into the electronic medium that even Jim now uses with little help and smoothly. So our John, an educator in his original career and continues to educate in his retirement. I found these particularly enjoyable of the celebration of the Haruzas and one of the fabulous houses in town, Frank and Ellie Wood's Paul V. Highland House at Lake and Sheridan. Tom is now deceased. The house is still a lovely place. It's still Jones. And the beginnings of that house in 1916 in the Woods Crest addition to Sheridan Boulevard, and the beautiful maintenance and utilization they make today, including a wonderful PAL event. And there, let's see, we can almost count down, or, in the room. There's Eileen on the far left, and then Kay. Bobby Allen has left the building. Bobby Allen is deceased, and there's Tom, who also had a wonderful wake in the backyard of the house a couple of years ago. Gary Martin and Lily Blaze and Roxanne Smith, the cast of characters and the continuity that PAL has provided. Looking down on the chandelier on the stairwell there, and the beautiful furnishing of that lovely house. And if you look closely at the buffet table here, attending the buffet table are a fellow named Scott Baird, and I think the woman with him would be Lyrian Gaylor Baird, our once and future mayor. Or projects that never go away. In fact, we don't want these projects to go away, or we wouldn't be the preservation folks. But the Wells Fargo building, one of our younger beautiful landmarks, the I.M. Pei building of the 70s, 13th and O, that as it has transitioned from one bank to another and another, and carries the beautiful cast-in-place concrete work from the exterior into the interior. Very, very high finish. You can't call it brutalism when it's done this way. This is refinedism that carried in all the way to the teller counters. And there was a moment when the bank, not NBC, but I think Wells Fargo, was concerned about, you could see a little scuffing on that concrete, and they were sure they should cover it over. And Tom Casper and Bob Ripley, very experienced with materials inside the Capitol, with persuasion and advice, helped them clean their counters and keep them in good shape. And that's why Tom, Bob, and property manager Morris Lang received the Stewardship Award that year. Now another bank is there, and I think we aren't quite sure what's going on inside, and we're interested again. And we would always be interested in a building of that quality and character. And speaking of buildings of quality and character and the kind of events PAL's been able to provide, at the McAfee House at 18th and C, when it underwent a transition last year from one owner to another through a friendly realtor, and the cooperation of both seller and buyer, because by the time we could get an event lined up here, the papers were signed, but both seller and buyer allowed PAL to have a lovely reception in this unique house, which has just the most elaborate interior features. We had a great discussion. As we stood in the living room, one participant who lived nearby said, "I've walked by here 1,000 times, and when I came in, I was so disappointed," because he didn't expect the elaboration from the exterior. And others replied, "Disappointed, not at all. It is what it was, and it is still a very spectacular interior, and somewhat of a surprise. This was the home of an interior decorator, and designed also by Paul Highland of Chicago, the same architect as the Haruza's Woods House, but it reflects the owners and the elaboration of a owner who wanted to show his chops in 1916 and had the funds, probably his wife Gertrude Marquette, McAfee's funds, to do so. And then has been very fortunate in years of ownership, typically by architects, or at least several of the owners along the way taking beautiful care of it were architects. And we don't win them all, or there wouldn't be a preservation group or a need for one in a community. This beautiful Mr. and Mrs. Donald Allen House on Woods Crest, which Pal applied what means were available, but there isn't a legal means to stop a private owner from making their decision about their house. But attention was brought and discussion was had, and unfortunately the cat operated and the building is lost. This will happen. Part of being in preservation is enduring when this happens and going on to the next brown bag and the next annual meeting and the next set of worthy awards, which there will be. So this being Preservation Month nationwide, as Eileen mentioned, PAL will we're already 3 events down, including the one we're in today. So it's not on this part of the flyer, it was on the top half of the flyer. But there will be the Near South tours, not PAL's activity, but PAL and Near South are close cooperating groups, and PAL will be handing out flyers at the Near South tour on Mother's Day on the 14th. Then we'll have the social in the ballroom, the dining room of the commercial club, fabulous space, well worth a visit. And there are old pictures of PAL visiting there over the years, but never in the condition it is today. Lincoln Commercial Club was the predecessor to Chamber of Commerce. And then the Piedmont Walk will be on May 21st from K. Logan Peters driveway, and there will be ice cream to go with it. And then Give to Lincoln Day, and PAL has participated in that for many years, and with some success, will be on May 24th. And after that, there will be another brown bag, there will be other walking tours, and PAL will go on, hopefully all the way to 2099, when the time capsule that PAL put in the ground at Wyuka in 1999 will reach its century mark and be ready to be opened. I won't be there. In fact, I would guess that none of us will be there, but hopefully PAL will be there if we've set up something that is of value to the community, that can continue to give people education and fun and a chance to share experiences with friendly people and welcome new people into our lovely community. That's 30 years in 50 minutes. And if there's things I missed, of course I did. These were drawn from thousands of available images, but I think it's a group to be proud of, should be proud of itself, and I think continues to be a productive contributor to the community. Yes?
And I had a question. I wasn't in Lincoln then, but the St. Elizabeth's and the saving of the chapel, if you will, did the front part of the building we see today exist?
The question involves the St. Francis Chapel and St. Elizabeth Hospital. The chapel was built purely as a wing stretching back from the main facade of the hospital. So you came through a first floor corridor, turned a corner south, and you were in a church. So you were going from patient rooms and corridors into the church. When all that was torn down, the bare front of the bell tower, because they have bells in that belfry, was just exposed, and the front of the corridor. Sinclair Hilly designed the front to go on, the staircases, and I think there's a access ramp built into that. They designed the brick finishing of a facade in a real simple fashion, because it never had an elaborate Gothic arch entrance or something, but just a nice, simple, functional, but appropriate looking entrance to what happens behind that entrance. County funded that, I think with Keno funds, after the demolition of the whole building. So that was part of that. And it was occurring in, 94, 95 or so. It was used as kind of a wedding chapel and concert hall for some years, but the small group that had worked with PAL, the St. Francis Chapel Foundation, finally kind of reached the point they couldn't do that anymore. And the county was approached then, I think, by the Catholic priests to take care of and operate in the building, which puts it back. Churches, one of the best uses for churches is as a church. And they can be great concert halls and things, but that doesn't sustain a building like weekly or daily use by a group for whom it was designed. We have cake. Bob.
Yes, I was going to ask, in your opinion, an approximate number, if there is one, of the number of properties in Lincoln that, in your opinion, should be National Register properties that are not yet to that point, leaving aside the issue of elapsed time and those sorts of things that may be qualifiers.
Bob's question involves, could I speculate wildly on what number of Lincoln properties might warrant National Register designation that aren't? And there's complexity to it, as you were alluding in the question, that National Register properties are typically 50 years old, and a whole bunch of 49-year-old properties this year are going to be 50 next year. I'm amazed at how many properties are 50 years old that I thought were pretty brand new. But as we age, that does occur. There are several thousand National Register properties in Lincoln today. Within the individually designated, there's 100 plus, and then within the large districts, which include Mount Emerald area, South Bottoms in the German-Russian neighborhood, Sheridan Boulevard, or what we call the Boulevards Historic District, which is about 1,200 individual properties. And if it's a contributing property in a National Register district, it has exactly the same status as an individually separately located or designated one. You have to get up to the capital character before you get up that other notch to a National Historic Landmark, of which the Capitol and Fairview are two in Lincoln. I think the only wise answer, Bob, is anybody who thinks they can identify all the things in our history that are significant is a fool. There are things we designate today that we wouldn't have looked at 30 years ago, and they really enrich our understanding of our past. The work that Kathy Caldwell did as my intern in her master's program at Community Regional Planning on African American landmarks in Lincoln that really hadn't been looked at, and seemed like not a rich field for study given Lincoln's demographics, but in fact there was a vibrant African American community in Lincoln from the time Lincoln became Lincoln, and evidences of physical evidence in archaeology and in buildings and in churches still stands. We weren't looking at that at a given point. There was a time when I was working on on the kind of Woods Park neighborhoods, and the bungalow district south of Woods Park was being designated, and a few people, if they hadn't heard my talks, were saying, well, those are just those little cracker box houses of the teens and 20s. Why are they important? And we could tell that story about Edward Gerke, the bungalow man, and his wife, the diarist, and their tours of all the state parks, till Ken Burns told their story later. And the houses there are small, but are great starter houses or aging in place houses, and the neighborhood was doing both of those, and they really do have high value. And then I was saying, it's not just about Sheridan Boulevard, which we had never designated. So eventually I had to come clean and help designate Sheridan Boulevard, because I was using it as a foil of, well, we do want to look at other things besides the biggest houses. Well, we should look at the biggest ones too, because there's rich stories there over generations, and and the first owner and the second one, and the people who maybe in the early censuses were the back stairs help in those houses as well. And all of those are parts of our history as well. So I think we will discover stories we can't imagine yet, or our successors will find those stories, and they will be important to the community. And I think part of a group like this is to be there and foster new ways of looking at. When I was asked about, in one of the state studies, what are some of the buildings around a very broad area around the Capitol that might be historically significant, one of them I put on my list was, you might have to look at the gas station at 18th and N that's now a bar called Panic, because I think it was the first bar operated by lesbian owners serving in part their community. And this was in about the 1970s, and that's 50 years ago. And now it's been since then a coffee house, and now I think is being converted to something else. But were we thinking about that component of our community, who we think about more readily now and are an important part of the whole rainbow of people in a city? Well, where are the sites that we might want to celebrate? Maybe that's one. So there's lots of them, Bob. Every year things get older. Thank you all for coming.